Hearst, Whores, and Homicide. In the summer of 1876, as America celebrated its centennial, a different kind of American dream was being born in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory. Deadwood Gulch, a narrow canyon carved by nature and widened by greed, would become the most infamous mining camp in American history. But the real story of Deadwood isn't the sanitized version you learned in school, nor even the gritty portrayal from HBO. The truth is far more scandalous, more violent, and more intricately corrupt than fiction could ever capture. This is a story of men who would kill for gold, and women who would sell their bodies for it. It's about opium-clouded backrooms where $1 million deals were struck, and brothel parlors where political futures were destroyed. At the center of it all stood George Hearst, the future senator and father of William Randolph Hearst, whose methods for acquiring wealth would make modern corporate raiders look like Sunday school teachers. But before we descend into the mud and blood of Deadwood streets, understand this. Everything you're about to hear is documented fact. The receipts exist in court records, newspaper accounts, personal letters, and death certificates. Some of these documents sat buried for a century, too explosive for their own time. Others were hidden away by families desperate to protect reputations. Now, finally, we can tell the whole truth about America's most notorious mining camp. The unholy trinity, Hearst, Swearingen, and the architecture of Vice George Hearst arrived in Deadwood in 1877, but his agents had been there since the first gold strike. By the time his private railroad car rolled into the nearest station, still 100 miles from, Deadwood itself, Hearst already owned claims that would eventually yield hundreds of millions in today as dollars. But Hearst understood something that separated him from ordinary prospectors. The real gold in Deadwood wasn't in the ground. It was in controlling the men who dug for it. Standing 5'9" with a paunch that spoke of good living, Hearst looked more like a prosperous grocer than one of the most ruthless men in the American West. But behind those mild blue eyes operated a mind that calculated human worth in ounces and pounds. His method was simple and devastating. Arrive in a mining town, identify the power structure, and then systematically corrupt or destroy it. In Deadwood, that power structure had a name, Al Swearingen. Ellis Alfred Swearingen, though no one dared call him Ellis, ran the Gem Variety Theater, a 3-story monument to vice that squatted on Main Street like a well-dressed tumor. The Gem wasn't just a saloon, gambling hall, and brothel. It was Deadwood's unofficial city hall, courthouse, and stock exchange rolled into one. From his office on the second floor, Swearingen controlled a network of information and influence that reached into every claim, every business, and every bedroom in the Gulch. The first meeting between Hearst and Swearingen took place in September 1877 in the Gem's private dining room. No transcript exists, but we know from multiple sources what was discussed. Hearst needed Swearingen's network to identify which claims were actually producing and which miners were desperate enough to sell cheap. Swearingen needed Hearst as capital and political connections to protect his empire from the encroaching forces of law and order. What emerged from that meeting was an alliance that would transform Deadwood from a chaotic mining camp into a machine for producing wealth and corpses. The system they created was brilliantly evil. Swearingen's girls didn't just provide sexual services, they were spies. Every drunken boast about a rich strike, every whispered worry about a played-out claim, every detail about who owed money to whom was reported back to Swearingen, who passed the intelligence to Hearst's agents. The information was so detailed that Hearst reportedly knew the exact gold yield of every major claim in Deadwood before the owners themselves had finished their assays. But information was just the beginning. When persuasion failed to secure a claim Hearst wanted, other methods were employed. The pattern was always the same. First came the generous offer, usually 30 to 40% below actual value. If that was refused, the miner would find himself in trouble. Perhaps he'd lose badly at the gem's rigged poker tables. Maybe he'd wake up in bed with one of Swearingen's girls and find himself accused of rape. Or sometimes he'd simply disappear. The Gem, a cathedral of corruption. To understand how Hearst operated in Deadwood, you must understand the Gem Theater. From the street, it looked respectable enough, a wooden false front painted burgundy and gold, with Gem spelled out in gilt letters. Gas lamps flanked the entrance, and Professor Dick Brown's orchestra could be heard playing from noon until dawn. But step through those bat-wing doors, and you entered a different world. The first floor was the public face, a mahogany bar that ran 60 feet along the west wall, imported from Chicago at enormous expense. Behind it, mirrors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, also from Chicago, that Swearingen had won in a poker game from a railroad. Executive. The main floor held gambling tables offering faro, poker, roulette, and chuck-a-luck. The dealers were all women, dressed in gowns that revealed enough to distract players from their losing hands, but the real business happened upstairs. The second floor contained Swearingen's office and apartment, plus 10 cribs, small rooms where the working girls entertained clients. These weren't ordinary prostitutes. Swearingen recruited educated women, many from good families who had fallen on hard times. He wanted girls who could hold conversations about politics and business, who could make a man feel important while extracting his secrets. The price list from 1878, discovered in the Deadwood archives, tells its own story. Brief entertainment, $1. Complete evening companionship, $5. Overnight intimacy, $10. Weekend arrangement, $25. Exclusive weekly booking, $100. But those were just the published rates. For special services, which might include anything from exotic performances to facilitating business meetings to providing alibis, the prices were negotiated privately. The third floor was where things got truly dark. Here were the opium dens, managed by Swearingen's Chinese partners. Opium wasn't just a drug in Deadwood, it was a tool of control. Get a man hooked on the pipe, and you owned him. The customer list for the third floor, partially recovered from a fire in 1879, reads like a who's who of Deadwood society. Judges, claim owners, assayers, even ministers. One of Swearingen's most valuable employees was a woman known only as Trixie in the historical record, though this was certainly not her real name. Described in contemporary accounts as handsome rather than beautiful, with dark hair and knowing eyes, Trixie was Swearingen's master spy. She specialized in powerful men with secrets to hide. A letter from Trixie to her sister in Chicago, discovered in an estate sale in 1987, provides a rare glimpse into the life of a high-class prostitute in Deadwood. Dearest Catherine, you ask about my work here, and I struggle to find words that won't shock you. I am well paid. Last month I cleared $400 after Al took his cut. The men here are lonely and foolish with their gold. Last night, a mining engineer from Colorado spent an hour crying in my arms about his wife, then paid me $50 to listen to him describe a new extraction process he's developed. Al was very pleased with that information. The work is not what you think. Yes, there is the physical aspect, but mostly I listen. These men want to boast about their strikes, complain about their partners, whisper about their plans. A girl with a good memory and sympathetic manner can earn more than any miner in these hills. But I won't lie to you, it's dangerous. Last week, one of the new girls, Sarah, refused a customer who wanted something unnatural. He broke her arm. Al had him thrown out, but only because damaged goods don't earn. We're commodities here, valuable ones, but commodities nonetheless. Still, I've saved nearly $3,000 another year, maybe 2, and I can buy that millinery shop in San Francisco we dreamed about. The letter cuts off there, water damage beyond reading. We don't know if Trixie ever made it to San Francisco. We do know that a woman matching her description was found dead in her room at the Gem in 1881, allegedly from an overdose of laudanum. Swearingen paid for an elaborate funeral, and the Episcopal minister noted that half the town attended. The other half probably had secrets they didn't want associated with her memory. The Chinese connection, opium, extortion, and control. While Swearingen controlled the Gem, he was smart enough to know he couldn't manage everything alone. His partnership with Deadwood's Chinese community was one of the most complex and brutal arrangements in the American West, led by a man known as Mr. Wu. Though his real name was Wu Canley, the Chinese controlled the opium trade, laundry services, and much of the underground economy. The Chinese had come to Deadwood the same way they'd come to every gold field in the West, following the strikes, willing to work claims that white miners had abandoned and providing services that others wouldn't. But in Deadwood, they found a different opportunity. Swearingen needed their opium connections. Wu needed protection from the violent racism that plagued Chinese communities throughout the West. The deal they struck was simple. Wu would manage the opium dens on the Gem's third floor and provide Swearingen with a steady supply of high-quality product from connections in San Francisco. In return, Swearingen would ensure the Chinese quarter remained unmolested and that Chinese-owned businesses could operate freely. But Wu was no mere drug dealer. He was a sophisticated businessman who understood that opium was just a means to an end. The real product was control. A ledger recovered from the ruins of the 1879 fire, written in a mixture of Chinese characters and coded English, reveals the extent of the operation. Notable entries include Judge HM minus 3 pipes weekly owes $340. Voted favorable on water rights, Reverend TS 2 pipes daily owes $890. Provided alibis for Chun case. Bank President JK Special Powder Blend owes $1,200. Approved loans for listed parties. The Special Powder Blend was particularly insidious. Wu's chemists would create custom mixtures of opium with other substances, sometimes cocaine, sometimes morphine, occasionally more exotic drugs imported from China. Each blend was tailored to the customer's desires and weaknesses. Get a man hooked on a unique mixture only you could provide, and he was yours forever. The relationship between the Chinese community and the white power structure was complex. On the surface, the Chinese were relegated to a ghetto on the edge of town, subject to special taxes and restrictions. But beneath that, they were integral to the town's economy of vice. Chinese laborers worked in the mines for half the wages of white miners. Chinese laundries washed the blood from shirts after late-night violence. Chinese cooks staffed the kitchens of hotels and brothels, and Chinese opium kept the powerful compliant. One particularly revealing incident occurred in October 1878. A group of white miners, drunk and angry about losing their jobs to Chinese workers willing to work for less, decided to raid the Chinese quarter. They got as far as the first laundry before Swearingen's men appeared. The leader of the mob, a foreman named Patrick O'Malley, was found the next morning in an alley, his throat cut. Pinned to his shirt was a note. No one touches Al's business interests. The message was clear. The Chinese weren't protected out of any sense of justice or equality. They were protected because they were valuable. And in Deadwood, value was the only morality that mattered. The ladies of the evening, a hierarchy of flesh, the prostitution industry in Deadwood was as stratified as any corporation. At the top were women like Trixie, educated, sophisticated, and earning hundreds of dollars a month. At the bottom were the crib girls, often immigrants or addicts, who serviced dozens of men a night for a few coins. In between was a complex hierarchy based on beauty, skill, and most importantly, the ability to extract information. Madame Dora Dufresne, who ran the Black Hills' most elegant brothel, left behind a detailed diary that provides an unvarnished look at the business. Her establishment, located just off Main Street, catered to the wealthy and powerful. Unlike the Gem, which was open to anyone with coin, Dora's required references and maintained strict standards. From her diary, dated March 15th, 1878, interviewed 3 new girls today. The first, calling herself Violet, claims to be from a good family in St. Louis. She has the manners and speech to support this, though I suspect Violet is not her Christian name. She can play piano and speaks French, both valuable skills in this business. Offered her 60% of earnings after house expenses. The second girl, Martha, is rougher trade. Pretty enough, but her grammar betrays her farmland origins. Still, she has that fresh quality some men prefer. We'll start her at 40%, see if she can be trained up. The third, Lord help me, the third is a child. Says she's 18, but can't be more than 15. Sent her to the Sisters of Mercy with $20 and a stern warning to never return. This business is hard enough on grown women. Business continues strong. Last night, Senator M visited again, specifically requesting Charlotte. He talks too much when he drinks, and Charlotte has a good memory. His information about the railroad routes proved valuable. I passed it to Mr. Hurst's man as agreed, and received a $500 bonus. The senator has no idea his pillow talk is making me rich. The economics of prostitution in Deadwood were staggering. A successful madam could earn $10,000 a month or more equivalent to over $300,000 today. The girls themselves, depending on their position in the hierarchy, might earn anywhere from $50 to $1,000 monthly. Compare this to a miner's average wage of $3 to $5 per day, and you understand why women traveled thousands of miles to work in places like Deadwood. But the human cost was enormous. Disease was rampant, not just venereal diseases, but tuberculosis, pneumonia, and infections from botched abortions. Violence was commonplace. Drug addiction was almost universal, whether to numb the emotional pain or simply to get through another night. A doctor's report from 1879, found in the Adams Museum archives, provides clinical details. Examined 47 working women this month per city ordinance. Results: 12 showing signs of syphilis in various stages, 8 with gonorrhea, 4 pregnant. Arrangements made with Dr. M for procedures. 3 with advanced tuberculosis, recommended immediate isolation. 15 addicted to opium or laudanum. 5 showing signs of physical abuse, requiring treatment. Only 11 in reasonable health average age. 23. Youngest, 16, claims 19. Oldest, 34, claims 28. Note: real ages difficult to determine. Most claim to be between 19 to 25, regardless of actual age. The harsh conditions age them rapidly. A woman of 25 here looks 35. Those who survive past 30 are rare. The arrangements with Dr. M referred to Dr. Luther McGillicuddy, who performed abortions for the working girls. His fee was $50 a month's earnings for many. Those who couldn't afford his services resorted to more dangerous methods. The cemetery records show at least a dozen women who died from female troubles, a euphemism everyone understood. Hearst's hostile takeovers, business by other means by 1878, George Hearst had identified his primary target, the Homestake Mine. It would eventually become one of the richest gold mines in history, operating until 2002 and producing 40 million ounces of gold. But in 1878, it was owned by a consortium of local miners led by the Manuel brothers, Fred and Moses. Hearst's first approach was typically straightforward. He offered $70,000 for the Manuel brothers' share of fortune by any standard, but far less than the mine's true value. The brothers refused. That's when things got interesting. Within a week of refusing Hearst's offer, Fred Manuel found himself in serious trouble. A girl from the Gem claimed he had violently assaulted her. The evidence was damning scratches on his face, torn clothing, witnesses who saw him leave her room. The fact that Fred had been playing poker with 6 reputable men at the time seemed to carry no weight. The girl's testimony was passionate and convincing. Then came the financial pressure. The Manuel brothers suddenly found their credit cut off at the local banks. Suppliers refused to extend terms for equipment. Workers were offered double wages to leave and work for Hearst's operations. A mysterious fire destroyed their stamp mill, setting back operations by months. But the killing blow came from an unexpected direction. Moses Manuel had a secret. He was addicted to opium, a habit he'd picked up after a mining accident left him in chronic pain. Wu's people had been supplying him with increasingly powerful blends, always on credit. Faced with ruin on all sides, the Manuel brothers finally sold. The price? $70,000, exactly what Hearst had originally offered. Within 5 years, the homestake was producing that amount in gold every month. This pattern repeated across Deadwood. The Keats mine, the Deadbroke claim, the Golden Star all fell to Hearst through a combination of financial pressure, blackmail, and when necessary, violence. A pattern emerged in the deaths. Thomas Keats, found at the bottom of a mine shaft. Accidental fall, Robert Deadbrook. Shot in a robbery. Nothing taken, Samuel Morrison. Disappeared, body never found. William Stark, poisoned by bad whiskey. Each man had refused to sell to Hearst. Each died within 6 months of that refusal. The local law enforcement, such as it was, seemed curiously ineffective. Sheriff Seth Bullock, famous for bringing law and order to Deadwood, kept meticulous records of minor crimes, public drunkenness, petty theft, fighting. But when it came to murders connected to mining disputes, the records become vague. Unknown assailant appears again and again, investigations that went nowhere. Witnesses who suddenly forgot what they saw. Was Bullock corrupt? The evidence suggests something more complex. A letter from Bullock to his wife, discovered in family papers, hints at the pressure he faced. My dearest Martha, you ask why I don't pursue certain matters more vigorously. How can I explain? To challenge men like Hearst is to challenge the very foundations of this town. The money that builds our schools and churches comes from these mines. The men who control the mines control everything else. I do what I can. I keep the peace on the streets. I prevent the worst excesses. But I am one man with a tin star, and they are an empire. I tell myself that partial justice is better than none. But late at night, I wonder if I'm just a more respectable kind of criminal. Pray for me, my dear. Pray for us all in this godforsaken place. The opium wars, control through chemistry, the 3rd floor of the gem was a world unto itself. Unlike the raucous saloon below or the business-like brothel on the 2nd floor, the opium dens were quiet, almost church-like. The windows were painted black and covered with heavy curtains. The air was thick with sweet smoke that seemed to muffle sound and slow time. The main den was a long room furnished with low couches and thick cushions. Chinese attendants moved silently between the customers, preparing pipes with practiced efficiency. The ritual was always the same. The heating of the bowl, the rolling of the opium pill, the careful placement in the pipe, the lighting and the long, deep draw that transported the smoker to another world. But not all customers were equal. The common room was for ordinary users-miners seeking escape from their brutal work. Prostitutes numbing their pain, clerks and shopkeepers looking for temporary paradise. The real business happened in the private rooms. These chambers were furnished with silk and jade imported from San Francisco's Chinatown. Here, Deadwood's elite could indulge their habits away from prying eyes. More importantly, here was where Wu conducted his real business. A former customer, writing anonymously to a San Francisco newspaper in 1895, described his experience. The first time Wu himself prepared my pipe. He was a small man, always impeccably dressed in Western clothes, speaking perfect English with only the slightest accent. He asked about my work, my family, my hopes and dreams. The opium made me talkative, trusting. I told him everything. The second time, he knew exactly what blend I needed. For a man of your refined sensibilities, he said, mixing something special. It was paradise. Each session, the blend was slightly different, always perfect, always leaving me wanting more. By the 6th month, I owed him $3,000. By the year's end, $10,000, but the debt wasn't really the point. By then, he knew every secret I had. My embezzlement from the bank, my affair with Judge Harrison's wife, the bribes I'd taken to approve certain loans. When Mr. Hurst needed the bank to foreclose on certain properties, Wu simply told me what to do. What choice did I have? Exposure meant ruin, prison, maybe death. So I did as I was told. We all did. That's what people don't understand about Deadwood. It wasn't the guns that gave men like Hurst power. It was the secrets, the debts, the little compromises that added up to complete control. By the time you realized you were owned, it was far too late. Wu's operation was sophisticated beyond anything seen in the American West. He employed chemists who had trained in Canton, men who understood not just opium but the entire pharmacopoeia of Chinese medicine. They created custom blends designed to enhance the drug's addictive properties while targeting specific weaknesses. For the judge who suffered from insomnia, opium mixed with valerian and cannabis. For the banker with chronic pain, opium with willow bark extract and cayenne. For the minister struggling with guilt, opium with mild hallucinogens that produce religious visions. Each blend was carefully recorded in Wu's ledgers, along with dosages, frequency of use, and most importantly, the customer's secrets revealed under the influence. These ledgers were Wu's insurance policy. Even Swearingen and Hurst treated him with wary respect, knowing that his records could destroy them as easily as anyone else. The dark side of the Bella Union. While the gem got most of the notoriety, the Bella Union was in many ways more dangerous. Run by Tom Nuttall, a former riverboat gambler with expensive tastes and flexible morals, the Bella Union catered to a slightly more upscale clientele than the gem. Its real specialty, however, was blackmail. The Bella Union's second floor was fitted with an innovation that would have been at home in a modern surveillance state, hidden peepholes and listening tubes. Nuttall had hired a German engineer to install a system of mirrors and tubes that allowed observers to watch and listen to what happened in the private rooms. The intelligence gathered was worth more than gold. A partial list of blackmail victims found in Nuttall's safe after his death reveals the scope of the operation. Mayor E.B. Farnham, filmed in compromising positions with multiple partners, both male and female Reverend Henry Smith, recorded purchasing abortion services for his mistress, Judge William Kuykendall, documented taking bribes in 3 separate cases. Dr. Amos Cochran, photographed in opium stupor while supposed to be performing surgery, Bank President James McClintock, caught embezzling funds to pay gambling debts. The technology was primitive but effective. Early photographs required long exposure times, but an unconscious or opium-addled subject could be posed as needed. The listening tubes, connected to hidden gramophone recording devices, could capture conversations clearly enough for voice identification. Nuttall's genius was in how he used this information. Rarely did he demand money directly. Instead, victims found themselves making favorable business decisions, voting certain ways, or providing introductions to useful people. The beauty of the system was that most victims never knew they were being blackmailed. They simply understood that crossing Tom Nuttall was bad for one's health and reputation. One particularly elaborate scheme involved the territorial governor's special representative, Silas Garber. Garber had come to Deadwood to investigate reports of corruption and violence. Within a week, he was a regular at the Bella Union, drawn by the sophisticated conversation and high-stakes poker games. What Garber didn't know was that the beautiful woman who seemed so taken with him, a widow named Constance Vale, was one of Nuttall's best operatives. She had been specifically chosen for her resemblance to Garber's deceased wife. The seduction was methodical and completely successful. The photographs taken of Garber and Constance were explicit even by modern standards, but Nuttall was too smart to use them immediately. Instead, he waited until Garber had filed his report, a glowing assessment that found no evidence of systematic corruption in Deadwood. Only then did Nuttall reveal what he had, not to extort money, but simply to ensure Garber never returned. The hidden war, Hearst versus the Syndicate by 1879. Hearst controlled much of Deadwood's mineral wealth, but he wasn't the only power in town. A group of Eastern investors, known locally as the Syndicate, had their own designs on the Black Hills gold, led by Franklin Bryant, a Wall Street speculator with connections to the Vanderbilt family. The Syndicate represented a more genteel but equally ruthless form of capitalism. The conflict between Hearst and the Syndicate played out like a chess game where the pieces were human lives. Both sides employed spies, saboteurs, and assassins. Both used the brothels and opium dens as weapons. The casualties mounted on both sides. Bryant's first move was to try to buy out Swearingen. He offered $100,000 for the gem 5 times what it was worth on paper. Swearingen refused, loyal to Hearst not out of friendship, but because he understood that Hearst was the devil he knew. Bryant's response was to open his own establishment, the Golden Eagle. The Golden Eagle was everything the gem wasn't: refined, elegant, and expensive. Bryant imported courtesans from New Orleans, dealers from Monaco, and chefs from Paris. The opium was the finest available. The whiskey was aged, and the girls all spoke multiple languages. It was a direct challenge to the established order. Hearst's response was swift and brutal. Within a month of the Golden Eagle's opening, 2 of its best girls were found murdered, their bodies bearing signs of torture. A fire destroyed its wine cellar and kitchen. Its head dealer was arrested for cheating. The evidence was planted. Several prominent customers received anonymous letters, threatening to expose their visits. But Bryant had resources too. He hired Pinkerton detectives to investigate Hearst's operations. He brought in his own muscle-former Union soldiers who had spent the years since the war working as mercenaries. He began buying up claims around Hearst's properties, threatening to cut off access to water and transportation routes. The war escalated throughout 1879. Bodies appeared in alleys with increasing frequency. Mines flooded under suspicious circumstances. Assay offices burned. The violence was starting to threaten the very gold production that had brought everyone to Deadwood in the first place. The incident at Chinatown, a massacre avoided, the tension between Hearst and the Syndicate nearly resulted in one of the worst massacres in Western history. On the night of August 14th, 1879, both factions simultaneously decided to raid Chinatown, each believing the other was using Wu's organization to spy on them. What saved Deadwood's Chinese population from slaughter was, ironically, their own preparation. Wu had been expecting something like this for months. He had armed his people, fortified key buildings, and most importantly, gathered intelligence on both factions' plans. When Hearst's men approached from the south and Bryant's from the north, they found Chinatown dark and seemingly deserted. In reality, hundreds of armed Chinese waited behind barricades, ready to defend their homes. But Wu had a better plan than bloodshed. As the two groups converged on the main square, a series of explosions rocked the night. Wu would mine the approaches to Chinatown, not to kill, but to confuse and disorient. In the smoke and chaos, Hearst and Bryant's men began firing at each other. The battle lasted less than an hour, but the casualties were significant. 12 of Hearst's men died, along with 15 of Bryant's. The Chinese suffered only minor injuries, mostly from flying debris. When the smoke cleared, both factions retreated, each blaming the other for the debacle. The next morning, Wu sent identical messages to Hurst and Bryant. "Gentlemen, you have seen what happens when you threaten my people. We desire only to conduct our business in peace. Continue your war if you must, but leave Chinatown out of it. Next time, we will not be so restrained." The message was received. From that point forward, both factions treated the Chinese quarter as neutral ground. Wu had demonstrated that the powerless weren't always helpless, and that even in Deadwood, there were lines that couldn't be crossed without consequences. The women who fought back, not all of Deadwood's working women were passive victims. Some fought back against the system that exploited them, using the very weapons that had been used against them: sex, secrets, and violence. Catherine Elder, known as Big Nose Kate, was one such woman. The longtime companion of Doc Holliday, Kate had worked in Deadwood's brothels before and after her time with the famous gunfighter, but Kate was no ordinary prostitute. She had a sharp mind, a sharper tongue, and absolutely no fear of powerful men. Kate's specialty was identifying corrupt lawmen and officials who preyed on working girls. She would seduce them, gather evidence of their crimes, and then expose them publicly. Her testimonies sent 3 sheriffs to prison and forced the resignation of countless others. She survived multiple assassination attempts, always emerging with a quip and a smile. Another fighter was Molly Johnson, known as Queen of the Blondes. Molly ran her own small brothel that served as a safe house for girls fleeing abusive madams or pimps. She taught her girls to read and write, helped them save their money, and when possible, helped them leave the life entirely. Molly's establishment was repeatedly targeted by Swearingen and others who saw her as a threat to their control. Her response was to arm her girls and train them in self-defense. The sight of a dozen armed prostitutes defending their house became one of Deadwood's most enduring images. But perhaps the most successful was Kitty Leroy, who used her earnings from prostitution to become one of Deadwood's most successful faro dealers and eventually a saloon owner in her own right. Kitty understood that in Deadwood, money was the only real protection. She carefully saved and invested her earnings, buying shares in mines and real estate. When men tried to muscle in on her businesses, she had the resources to fight back. She hired her own gunmen, bribed her own officials, and played the corruption game as well as any man. Kitty's diary, discovered in a wall during renovations in the 1960s, provides insight into her strategy. The men think we're weak because we sell our bodies. They don't understand that we're selling them a fantasy and keeping our true selves hidden. Every moan, every sigh, every word of affection is calculated. We are actresses in the theater of their desires. But while they're lost in their lust, we're watching, listening, learning. I know which judge takes bribes, which banker embezzles, which minister visits the Chinese opium dens. This knowledge is my insurance, my weapon, my path to freedom. Let them think they own us. In truth, we own them, their secrets, their shame, their weakness. In Deadwood, everyone is for sale. The only question is whether you're setting the price or paying it. The Great Fire and its convenient victims on September 26, 1879. A fire broke out in the Empire Bakery on Sherman Street. Within hours, driven by strong winds and fed by the wooden buildings packed tightly together, it had consumed most of Deadwood's business district. The official death toll was 3, but anyone who knew Deadwood understood that the real number was much higher. Fires were common in mining towns, but this one was different. Too many convenient deaths, too many strategic buildings destroyed, too many records lost forever. The pattern was clear to those who looked. The Deadwood Pioneer newspaper office, destroyed along with all back issues and files documenting corruption. The Territorial Assay Office, burned with records showing the true ownership of numerous disputed claims. The law offices of Jensen and Associates, consumed along with depositions in several cases against Hearst the Methodist Church, lost with its marriage and death records that contradicted official stories. But most suspicious were the bodies found in the ruins, or rather, the bodies that weren't found. At least 7 men who had been scheduled to testify in various corruption trials disappeared in the fire. Their bodies were never recovered, despite extensive searching. Either they had been vaporized by the heat, unlikely, or they had never been in those buildings at all. One survivor, a prostitute named French Marie, later told investigators what she had seen. The fire hadn't even reached Main Street when I saw the men with torches, moving building to building. They weren't trying to put out fires. They were setting them. I recognized one, Johnny Burns, who worked for Hearst. He saw me watching and raised his gun. I ran and hid in a root cellar until morning. When I came out, half the town was gone. But you want to know something strange? The Gem, the Bella Union, all the big saloons and brothels, they survived. Funny how the fire burned around them, isn't it? Almost like someone was directing it. French Marie disappeared 2 days after giving this statement. Her body was found a week later in Whitewood Creek, an apparent suicide. The coroner noted the unusual number of bruises on her body, but ruled them consistent with being carried downstream by the current. The fire served multiple purposes. It destroyed evidence, eliminated witnesses, and allowed for a massive land grab, as disputed properties were quickly claimed and rebuilt. Within 6 months, Hearst's control over Deadwood was nearly absolute. The syndicate, having lost crucial documents and several key personnel, largely withdrew from the Black Hills. The medical horrors, Dr. McGillicuddy's Chamber of Secrets, Dr. Luther McGillicuddy, occupied a unique position in Deadwood society. As one of the few trained physicians in the territory, he was indispensable. As the man who performed abortions, treated venereal diseases, and patched up victims of violence, he knew everyone's secrets. His medical practice was a clearinghouse for the town's darkest dealings. McGillicuddy's office ledgers, donated to the University of South Dakota after his death, make for horrifying reading. Written in medical Latin mixed with his own code, they document not just treatments, but the circumstances behind injuries. Patient X, Madam D's employee, severe vaginal tearing from assault by group of minors, treated with carbolic acid and opium, survived but will never bear children. Madam D paid double to ensure no report to sheriff. Patient Y, prominent merchant. Mercury treatment for tertiary syphilis continues. Dementia advancing. Wife unaware of condition. Patient pays premium for discretion. Patient Z, name encoded. Gunshot wound to abdomen, claims hunting accident. Bullet trajectory inconsistent with story. Likely dueling wound. Treated and discharged. Died 2 days later from pneumonia. But McGillicuddy wasn't just a passive observer. He was an active participant in Deadwood's economy of vice. His abortion practice was particularly lucrative, charging anywhere from $50 to $500, depending on the client's ability to pay and need for secrecy. He performed an estimated 200 to 300 procedures per year, not all of them successfully. His private notes reveal the toll. Another girl died today. Sarah, I think her name was, though they all use false names. Hemorrhaging, I couldn't stop. She was perhaps 16, certainly no older. The madam who brought her seemed more concerned about disposal of the body than the loss of life. I drink to forget, but the faces remain. McGillicuddy also conducted medical experiments that would horrify modern ethicists. Using prostitutes and Chinese laborers as test subjects, he tried various treatments for venereal diseases, including injections of silver nitrate, applications of acid, and even primitive surgical interventions. His notes clinically document the suffering these caused. Subject 12, Chinese male, aged approximately 25, Injection of silver nitrate solution directly into chancres. Subject experienced extreme pain, required restraint. Lesions showed improvement initially, but patient developed severe kidney failure. Died day 6. Conclusion. Dosage too high, dilution needed. The doctor's relationship with the power structure was complex. He was protected because he was useful, but also feared because of what he knew. His sudden death in 1882 from a heart attack at age 41 raised eyebrows, especially when his successor discovered that many of his most sensitive files were missing. The children of Deadwood, innocence lost, perhaps the darkest chapter in Deadwood's history involves its most vulnerable residents, the children. In a town built on vice and violence, childhood was a luxury few could afford. The stories of Deadwood's children reveal a system of exploitation that reached into every corner of society. The official census of 1880 listed 127 children under the age of 16 in Deadwood. The real number was certainly higher, as many were deliberately hidden from authorities. These children fell into several categories, each with its own particular horrors. Children of prostitutes. Most brothels had rules against employees keeping children, but babies were born nonetheless. Those who survived infancy faced a harsh existence. Boys were often put to work as young as 8 or 9, running errands, cleaning, and learning the criminal trades. Girls ... Their fate was often sealed from birth. A social worker's report from 1885 described conditions, found 7 children living in the backrooms of the gym theater, ages estimated 5 to 12. All showed signs of malnutrition and abuse. The older girls were already being groomed for future employment. One child, perhaps 10, was serving drinks to customers while dressed in adult clothing and rouge. When questioned, she said this was practice for when she was older. Orphans and runaways. Deadwood attracted desperate children from across the frontier. Some were orphaned by mining accidents or disease. Others ran away from abusive homes, only to find worse awaiting them. These children survived by any means necessary: theft, begging, or selling themselves. The Deadwood Orphanage, established in 1878 by well-meaning citizens, quickly became a hunting ground for predators. The matron, Mrs. Elmira Thornton, was later discovered to be selling children to brothels and wealthy patrons who had particular tastes. Her trial in 1881 revealed a network of child trafficking that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. Children of the Chinese. The Chinese community tried to protect its children, but they faced unique vulnerabilities. Chinese children had no legal standing and could be taken from their parents on any pretext. Many disappeared into domestic servitude or worse. Wu's organization, for all its criminal activities, apparently drew the line at exploiting children. His men were known to rescue Chinese children from abusive situations and return them to their families. But even Wu couldn't protect them all. The adopted children. Wealthy men in Deadwood often had wards or adopted children, who were nothing of the sort. These children, usually girls between 10 and 14, were kept in private homes as domestic servants and worse. The practice was an open secret, tolerated because the men involved were too powerful to challenge. One particularly notorious case involved Judge Harold Patterson, who had 3 nieces living in his mansion. When one of them, a 13-year-old named Lucy, threw herself from a second-story window rather than submit to his advances, the incident was ruled an accident. The other 2 girls disappeared shortly after, reportedly sent back east for schooling. The few children who survived Deadwood intact often carried psychological scars for life. Mary Catherine Sullivan, who lived in Deadwood from age 8 to 14 while her mother worked in the brothels, later wrote, "We learned early to make ourselves invisible, to walk quickly past groups of drunken men, to never go out after dark, to always have an escape route, We grew up knowing too much about the world's cruelties and nothing about its kindnesses. Childhood was a foreign country we never got to visit. The Pinkerton Files, professional spies in the Gulch. When Franklin Brandt's syndicate began losing ground to Hearst, they brought in the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The Pinkertons were already infamous for their strike-breaking activities and industrial espionage. In Deadwood, they found a challenge worthy of their reputation. The lead operative was James McParland, fresh from his successful infiltration of the Molly Maguires in Pennsylvania. McParland arrived in Deadwood in early 1879, posing as a mining engineer named James McKenna. His mission was to gather intelligence on Hearst's operations and, if possible, find evidence of criminal activities that could be used in court. McParland's reports, preserved in the Pinkerton archives, provide an outsider's view of Deadwood's corruption. March 15, 1879. The depth of criminality here exceeds anything I witnessed in Pennsylvania. Murder is commonplace, conducted as openly as any business transaction. Last night, I witnessed a man shot dead in the Gem Theater. The killer calmly finished his drink before walking out. No one moved to stop him or aid the victim. Have established contact with several of Hearst's employees. They speak freely when drunk, which is often. Hearst himself rarely appears in public, conducting business through intermediaries. Chief among these is one Al Swearingen, who runs the Gem Theater. Swearingen is intelligent, ruthless, and completely without moral restraint. He would be a valuable asset if he could be turned. The prostitutes are the best source of information. They hear everything and, for the right price, will share it. Have cultivated relationships with several, though the emotional toll of hearing their stories is significant. These women are trapped in a system designed to destroy them, and they know it. McParland's efforts to gather evidence were frustrated at every turn. Potential witnesses disappeared or recanted. Documents vanished from supposedly secure locations. On one occasion, McParland returned to his room to find it ransacked and a note on his pillow. "We know who you are. Leave or join your Molly friends in hell." But McParland persisted, slowly building a network of informants. His greatest coup was turning Thomas Price, one of Hearst's bookkeepers. Price, drowning in gambling debts and terrified of what Hearst would do when the embezzlement was discovered, agreed to provide documents in exchange for protection and passage out of Deadwood. The night before the planned exchange, Price was found in his office with his throat cut. The safe was empty, all records destroyed. McParland himself barely escaped Deadwood alive, leaving on a midnight stage after receiving word that gunmen were looking for him. His final report was blunt: Deadwood is beyond redemption by legal means. The corruption is total, from the lowest criminal to the highest official. Men like Hearst have created a system where justice is impossible because they own everyone who might dispense it. The only solution would be federal intervention on a massive scale, and even then, the rot might be too deep to cut out. I've seen evil in many forms, but Deadwood represents something new. Evil as a business model, efficiently organized and ruthlessly implemented. God help anyone caught in its machinery. The Deadwood Death Lists. One of the most chilling documents to emerge from this era is what historians call the Deadwood Death Lists. These were literal lists of names, found in various locations after the town's eventual cleanup, marking people for elimination. The lists were written in different hands, but showed clear coordination. A list found in the ruins of the Bella Union, dated June 1879. Feldman knows too much about smelter operation. Found dead July 2nd, 1879. T. Chen, refusing to pay protection. Disappeared July 8th, 1879. S. Morrison, talking to federal marshals. Shot July 14th, 1879. B. Williams, threatening to go to newspapers. Died in fire July 20th, 1879. C. DuPont, for getting ambitious. Fountain Creek, July 27th, 1879. What makes these lists particularly horrifying is their business-like nature. Deaths were planned like inventory orders, with notes on method, timing, and who should carry out the killing. Some entries included personal details to help assassins identify their targets. Others had notes like, "Make it look accidental," or "Family 2, no witnesses." Cross-referencing these lists with death records reveals an appalling truth. The success rate was over 90%. Once your name appeared on a list, you were essentially already dead. The few who survived did so by fleeing Deadwood immediately, and even then, some were hunted down in other towns. The lists also reveal the web of cooperation between supposedly rival factions. Names of Hearst enemies appear on lists found in syndicate properties, and vice versa. It seems that while the big players fought for control, they were happy to help each other eliminate common threats. One particularly damning list was found sewn into the lining of a coat belonging to Dan Doherty, Swearingen's chief enforcer. This list didn't just name targets, it included prices. Killing clean, $50. Killing messy, for example, $75. Disappearance, $100. Accident, $150. Family job, $500. The casual commercialization of murder speaks to how completely moral boundaries had dissolved in Deadwood. Life had a specific, clearly defined monetary value, and that value was shockingly low. The banker's game, financial fraud on the frontier, while gunmen and prostitutes grabbed headlines, the real theft in Deadwood happened in banks and assay offices. The financial fraud perpetrated during the boom years dwarfed anything stolen at gunpoint. And at the center of it all was the first bank of Deadwood, run by Alma Garrett's husband, Brom Garrett. Brom Garrett arrived in Deadwood with impeccable credentials and substantial capital from Eastern investors. He quickly established the first bank as the premier financial institution in the Black Hills. What his investors didn't know was that Garrett was running one of the most elaborate Ponzi schemes in American history. The scheme worked like this. Garrett would loan money to prospectors at exorbitant interest rates, often 10% per month. When they couldn't pay, he would foreclose on their claims. But instead of selling these claims, he would create fictitious mining companies, issue stock, and sell shares to Eastern investors based on falsified assay reports. To maintain the illusion, Garrett needed accomplices. He found them in the assay offices. For a cut of the profits, assayers would certify that worthless holes in the ground were bonanzas waiting to be harvested. The reports were works of fiction, full of technical language designed to impress and deceive. One assayer, Richard Harmon, later testified, shortly before his mysterious death, about the process. Garrett would bring me samples, not from the claims he was selling, but from productive mines. I would test these and write reports as if they came from his properties. For this, I received $500 per report, more than I made in a month of honest work. I knew it was wrong, but in Deadwood, everyone was stealing from everyone else. Why should I be different? The scheme required constant expansion. Garrett had to continually find new investors to pay off old ones. He recruited prominent citizens as board members for his fictitious companies, giving them shares in exchange for their names and reputations. Many genuinely believed they were investing in legitimate operations. But Garrett's biggest coup was convincing the territorial government to deposit its funds in his bank. With government money as backing, he could leverage even larger loans and bigger schemes. The collapse, when it came, was spectacular. It started with a single Eastern investor who decided to visit his highly productive mine. He found a hole in the ground with no equipment, no workers, and no gold. His telegrams to other investors started a panic. Within days, the first bank was besieged by depositors demanding their money. Garrett tried to maintain calm, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. Then, on the night of August 3rd, 1879, he disappeared. Some say he fled to South America with a fortune in gold. Others believe he met a violent end from angry investors. His body was never found. The bank's collapse ruined hundreds of small depositors and several large investors. The territorial government lost $400,000, money that was supposed to build schools and roads. Several prominent citizens committed suicide rather than face disgrace. The reverberations were felt all the way to Wall Street. But here's the truly remarkable part. Within 6 months, a new bank had opened in the same building, run by associates of George Hearst. Many of the same people who had been ruined by Garrett as fraud now borrowed from Hearst's bank to start over. The cycle continued with new players, but the same game. The medicine show. Addiction as business model. While opium dens served the criminal elite, the working class of Deadwood had their own drug problem. Patent medicines. These medicines were sold everywhere in saloons, general stores, even churches. They promised to cure everything from female troubles to mining fatigue. What they actually contained was alcohol, opium, cocaine, and sometimes worse. The king of Deadwood's medicine trade was Professor Elias Montague, whose miracle elixir was advertised as the miner's friend. Montague's traveling medicine show was a weekly event, complete with Indian dancers, usually Mexicans in costume, testimonials from cured patients, paid actors, and free samples to get customers hooked on the formula for Montague's miracle. Elixir, revealed in court documents after his arrest in Denver, was 40% alcohol, 15% opium tincture, 10% cocaine solution, 10% cannabis extract, 25% sugar water, and flavoring at the recommended dose of 3 tablespoons daily for health, more as needed for ailments. Users quickly developed powerful addictions. But Montague was clever. He constantly adjusted the formula, increasing the addictive substances gradually so users needed more and more to achieve the same effect. The real genius was in the marketing. Montague specifically targeted minors, suffering from chronic pain and exhaustion, prostitutes, dealing with emotional trauma and disease, housewives struggling with melancholy, depression, children who were difficult to manage. Yes, children. Montague's children's comfort syrup was marketed to exhausted mothers as a way to quiet fussy babies. It contained enough opium to sedate an adult. The long-term effects on these children were catastrophic, but in the short term, it created a generation of addicted mothers who couldn't function without their medicine. One victim, Mary O'Sullivan, wrote to her sister, "I started taking the elixir for my women's troubles after my 5th miscarriage. It helped. Oh, how it helped. The pain went away, the sadness lifted. But now I need it just to get out of bed. I spend half my husband's wages on it. I've tried to stop, but the sickness that comes is unbearable. I shake, I sweat, I see things that aren't there. So I take more, always more." Montague wasn't alone. Deadwood hosted dozens of medicine shows and doctors peddling addiction in a bottle. Dr. Hamlin's wizard oil, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Ayer's cherry pectoral all contained powerful narcotics. None disclosed on the label. The authorities, such as they were, did nothing. Many were customers themselves, using patent medicines to deal with the stress and violence of their jobs. The real doctors in town knew what was happening, but were powerless to stop it. Some even profited from it, treating withdrawal symptoms. And overdoses. The medicine show reached its grotesque peak with Dr. Cornelius Blackwood's resurrection. Tonic. Blackwood claimed his tonic could raise the nearly dead and restore full vitality. His shows featured seemingly corpse-like volunteers who would be revived. With a dose of tonic. The truth was darker. The corpses were homeless men and down-and-out miners, paid in liquor to play dead. The resurrection came from a massive dose of cocaine and strychnine that sent them into convulsions that Blackwood marketed as the life force returning. Several men died during these demonstrations, their deaths attributed to their weakness rather than Blackwood's poison. The patent medicine trade in Deadwood generated enormous profits, an estimated $500,000 annually by 1880. This money flowed upward, with people like Hearst taking a cut from every bottle sold in establishments they controlled. Addiction was just another revenue stream, another way to keep the population dependent and docile. The sporting life, gambling, graft, and fixed games, if prostitution was Deadwood's first industry and mining its second, gambling was a close third. Every saloon had gaming tables, every hotel a poker room. The amounts wagered were staggering. Minors would lose 6 months' earnings in a single night, and wealthy visitors could drop thousands on a roll of the dice. But in Deadwood, no game was honest. The level of organized cheating was remarkable, a coordinated system that ensured the house always won and the right people always got their cut. At the center of this web was Colorado Charlie, Utter, Wild Bill Haycock's friend and Deadwood's unofficial gambling commissioner. Charlie's genius was in organizing what had been random cheating into a science. He established a school for dealers, where they learned multiple techniques for marking cards, how to manipulate dice throws, sleight of hand for switching decks, reading tells and managing marks, when to let someone win to keep them playing. The psychology was as important as the mechanics. Charlie taught his dealers to identify different types of players: the roosters, aggressive players who needed to be challenged, the pigeons, easy marks who could be plucked repeatedly, the whales, big spenders who required special handling, the sharks, professional gamblers who needed to be driven out. Each type required different techniques. A rooster might be allowed to win early to build confidence, then fleeced when the stakes got high. A pigeon would be bled slowly, losing just enough to keep hoping for a turnaround. Whales got the full treatment-free drinks, companionship from the finest girls, private rooms where they could lose fortunes in comfort. The coordination between establishments was remarkable. If a mark went too much at one place, word would spread instantly. He would find himself winning at the next place too, building confidence. Then, when he was convinced he had a hot streak, he would be directed to a high-stakes game where a professional mechanics would clean him out. One victim, railroad engineer James Patterson, described his experience in a letter to his wife. I arrived with $5,000, intending to invest in mining properties. The first night, I won $500 at poker in the Bella Union. The next night, $800 at Faro in the Gem. I felt invincible, like I had discovered a talent I never knew existed. On the third night, they invited me to a private game. For serious players, only they said that by dawn, I had lost everything. Not just my $5,000, but another $3,000 I borrowed against my salary. As I stumbled out, broke and drunk, I overheard one dealer say to another, like shearing sheep. That's all we were to them, sheep. To be sheared. The bigger cons were even more elaborate. One involved a fake mining engineer who would befriend wealthy visitors, showing them ore samples from secret strikes. He would reluctantly allow them to buy in, then arrange a poker game where the visitor could win the deed to the mine. Of course, the mine was worthless, the samples were salted, and everyone at the poker table was in on the con. Charlie Utter kept detailed records of every game, every mark, every take. His ledgers, recovered from a hidden safe, show that organized gambling in Deadwood generated over $2 million annually by 1879. Of this, approximately 40% went to the houses, 30% to the dealers and mechanics, 20% to protection and bribes, and 10% to people like Hearst who allowed the operations to continue. That the real profit wasn't in the direct take, it was in the secondary effects. A man who lost everything at gambling became desperate. Desperate men sold their claims cheap, borrowed at usurious rates, or turned to crime. Each ruined gambler was a potential opportunity for those who controlled Deadwood's economy. Blood sports and brutal entertainment, Deadwood's appetite for violence wasn't satisfied by mere murders and gunfights. The town craved blood sports, spectacles of brutality that would shock even hardened modern audiences. These events served multiple purposes: entertainment for the masses, gambling opportunities for the wealthy, and a way to dispose of unwanted individuals. The most notorious venue was Swearingen's Gem Theater, which hosted weekly boxing matches that were more like gladiatorial. Combats. The rules were simple: fight until one man couldn't continue. No rounds, no time limits, no mercy. Fighters used not just fists, but kicks, headbutts, and sometimes concealed weapons. Deaths were common and added to the excitement. The fighters were recruited from the desperate, miners who had lost everything, immigrants who couldn't find work, criminals given a choice between the noose and the ring. They fought for purses ranging from $50 to $500, though few lived long enough to enjoy their winnings. One fighter, Irish immigrant Patrick Crusher McGrath, left a diary describing his experiences. Fought my 12th bout tonight against a Cornishman. Twice my size. The crowd wanted blood, and by God, they got it. Broke his jaw in the 3rd minute, his nose in the 5th. He kept coming until I put my thumb through his eye. Even then, he tried to continue, blood streaming down his face before collapsing. The crowd cheered like demons. Money changed hands, thousands wagered on our suffering. Swearingen paid me my $100, said I was becoming a draw. But how many more? Fights before I'm the one carried out? I see the other fighters, those who survived broken men, faces like melted wax, minds gone from too many blows. Is $100 worth becoming that? But boxing was civilized compared to other entertainments. Dogfighting was popular, with specially bred pit bulls imported from eastern cities. The fights were held in cellars and backrooms, away from even Deadwood's minimal law enforcement. The dogs fought to the death while spectators wagered enormous sums. Even more depraved were the rat battles. Terriers would be placed in pits with dozens of rats, and bets placed on how many they could kill in a set time. The record, according to newspaper accounts, was 87 rats in 15 minutes by a terrier named Killer. Owned by a Chinese merchant. Bear baiting still occurred occasionally, though bears were becoming scarce. A captured grizzly would be chained in a pit while dogs were set on it. The bear, often drugged or wounded beforehand to even the odds, would fight desperately while spectators bet on how long it would last, or how many dogs it would kill. But perhaps the most disturbing were the human blood sports disguised as justice. Public executions were major events, with viewing stands erected and tickets sold. The condemned were expected to put on a show giving speeches, showing defiance or remorse as the crowd preferred. Those who died well were applauded. Those who showed fear were mocked. One execution, that of horse thief Mexican Joe in 1878, turned into a grotesque carnival. The rope was deliberately measured wrong, so instead of a clean break, Joe slowly strangled the crowd rather than showing. Mercy began taking bets on how long he would twitch. It took 17 minutes for him to die. While vendors sold beer and peanuts to the watching crowd, these blood sports served a deeper purpose in Deadwood's psychology. They normalized violence, made it entertainment rather than tragedy. A population that cheered while men beat each other to death was less likely to object when bodies appeared in alleys. The powerful understood this bred in circuses' frontier style. The Deadwood social register, hypocrisy in high places, while the lowlifes and criminals of Deadwood operated openly. The town's respectable citizens maintained elaborate facades that hid participation in the very vices they publicly condemned. The hypocrisy was staggering, documented in private letters, diaries, and blackmail files that surfaced years later. Take Reverend Henry Smith, pastor of Deadwood's First Congregational Church. From the pulpit, he thundered against the evils of prostitution, gambling, and liquor. His sermons were printed in the newspaper as examples of moral leadership. But Nuttall's blackmail files tell a different story. Reverend Smith was a regular at the Bella Union, where he had a standing appointment every Thursday with a girl named Violet. But his tastes ran darker than simple fornication. The Reverend liked to be whipped while reciting scripture, paying extra for blasphemous variations on biblical passages. Violet's testimony, given in a sealed deposition, described sessions that would make the Marquis de Sade blush. The Reverend's activities might have remained secret, but he made the mistake of refusing to bury a prostitute in the church cemetery. Nuttall quietly informed him that certain photographic plates might find their way to the church deacons. The next Sunday, Smith preached on Mary Magdalene and Christ's forgiveness of fallen women. The prostitute got her church burial, thought Judge William. Kai Kendall presented himself as a stern lawman bringing order to chaos. His courtroom was known for harsh sentences and moral lectures. Yet the judge maintained a private opium den in his basement, where he would preside over debauched parties that combined drugs, sex, and what participants described as Roman festivities. A memoir by one participant, published anonymously in a San Francisco newspaper, described these gatherings. The judge would dress in a toga, crown himself with laurels, and demand we address him as Caesar. Young men and women, most barely clothed, would serve wine and opium while the judge held court, passing judgments that usually involved sexual acts performed for his amusement. The same man who sentenced prostitutes to jail by day would pay those same women to degrade themselves at night. The hypocrisy was absolute, but we all participated. In Deadwood, everyone had secrets, and secrets were currency. Mrs. Ilvair Carrington, president of the Deadwood Ladies' Temperance Society, waged a fierce campaign against alcohol. She organized marches, published pamphlets, and even convinced some saloons to close on Sundays. What her followers didn't know was that Mrs. Carrington was addicted to laudanum, liquid opium dissolved in alcohol. Her supplier was none other than Al Swearingen, who provided her with a special blend he called Temperance Tonic. The irony of the temperance later being supplied by the town's biggest vice lord was lost on no one except her followers. Swearingen reportedly found it hilarious, often joking that he was supporting the temperance movement one bottle at a time. The Deadwood Bank and Trust Board of Directors met monthly to discuss loans and investments. The official minutes show sober discussions of interest rates and collateral, but the real meetings happened afterward at the Gem, where board members would drink, gamble, and bed prostitutes while deciding who got loans and who got foreclosed upon. One board member, Frederick Hastings, kept a private journal that detailed these after meetings, approved foreclosure on the widow Martinez while Scarlett sat on my lap, her hand busy beneath the table. Denied expansion loan to Thompson because he refused to sell his water rights to Hearst. Celebrated by winning $500 at Faro, the dealer insured it, and spending the night with twins from New Orleans. This is how business is done in Deadwood. Fortunes made and destroyed between the whiskey and the whores. We pretend respectability by day and reveal our true natures by night. Perhaps that's the most honest thing about this dishonest place. The Underground Railroad of vice, trafficking networks, Deadwood's appetite for fresh faces in its brothels, required a constant supply of new women. What developed was a sophisticated trafficking network that stretched from the East Coast to the Pacific, from Mexico to Canada. The mechanics of this trade reveal the industrial scale of exploitation. The network had recruiters in major cities who targeted vulnerable women, immigrants who spoke little English, farm girls seeking city life, widows with no means of support, women fleeing abusive marriages. The recruiters, often women themselves, would offer legitimate work as seamstresses, domestic servants, or entertainers in the Western theaters. One recruiter, Margaret Pegleg Mag Morrison, she lost her leg in a carriage accident, later testified about her methods. I would dress respectable, hang around the immigrant ships or train stations, look for girls traveling alone, especially those who seemed lost or frightened. I'd offer help a place to stay, a hot meal, assistance finding work. I'd gain their trust over days or weeks, then suggest this wonderful opportunity out west. Good wages, adventure, respectable work in the theaters. Once they agreed, I'd arrange their travel, always with escorts, to ensure they didn't change their minds. By the time they realized what kind of theater work awaited them, they were thousands of miles from home, in debt for their passage, with no friends and no options. The transportation network was elaborate. Women would be moved in groups, accompanied by chaperones who were actually guards. They traveled in special railway cars, ostensibly for their protection, but actually to prevent escape. Rest stops were at specific hotels that were part of the network. One woman who escaped, Sarah Jennings, described her journey. There were 12 of us in the car, all young, all told we were going to work in hotels or theaters. Our chaperone, Mrs. Black, seemed kind at first, but turned cold when one girl tried to leave at a station. She had the girl drugged, said she was ill, and carried back to the car. We weren't allowed to talk to anyone at stops. Our meals were brought to us. When I asked to send a letter home, Mrs. Black said it would be posted from Deadwood, to surprise your family with your success. I knew then we were prisoners. Upon arriving in Deadwood, the women would be taken to a breaking-in house, usually, a nondescript building away from the main brothel district. Here, they would be introduced to their new reality through a combination of rape, drugs, and psychological manipulation. The process was designed to destroy their will to resist. Economics were brutal. Women were told they owed money for transportation, $200 to $500, clothing and toiletries, $100 to $200, room and board, $50 per week, protection, $25 per week, medical examinations, $10 per week at typical earnings. Even working constantly, it would take years to pay off these debts. And the madams had ways of ensuring the debts never decreased fines for refusing customers, charges for breaking dishes, fees for missing work due to illness or injury, but the trafficking wasn't limited to women. Young Chinese men were brought in to work the mines and railroads under similar debt bondage. Children were trafficked for various purposes, some for labor, others for darker needs. Deadwood's appetite for human flesh in all its forms seemed insatiable. The few who tried to help these victims face severe consequences. A Catholic priest, Father Michael O'Brien, attempted to establish a sanctuary for women fleeing the brothels. His church was burned down twice, the second time he was inside it. The fire was ruled accidental. A group of Chinese merchants tried to buy the freedom of their enslaved countrymen. They were found murdered, their gold stolen. The message was clear. The trafficking networks were protected at the highest levels. Any interference would be met with lethal force. The medical experiments, Dr. McGillicuddy's Chamber of Secrets, continued. While we touched on Dr. McGillicuddy's abortion practice earlier, his medical experiments went far deeper into darkness. Using Deadwood's disposable population as test subjects, he conducted research that would have been condemned even by the loose standards of 19th century medicine. His private laboratory, hidden in the basement of his official practice, was discovered only after his death. The equipment found there, along with his detailed notes, revealed experiments that belonged more in a horror novel than a medical practice. McGillicuddy was obsessed with venereal diseases. seeing them as both a medical challenge and a business opportunity. He tested various treatments on infected prostitutes, often without their knowledge or consent. His notes, written a mixture of Latin and English, document horrific procedures. Subject 23, Chinese female. Approximately 20, applied solution of mercury directly to syphilitic lesions. Subject experienced extreme pain, required restraint. Lesions initially appeared to improve, but subject developed severe neurological symptoms, tremors, hallucinations, paralysis. Death on day 12. Conclusion. Direct application too concentrated. Subject 24. White female. Daisy. Attempted surgical removal of syphilitic tumors. Subject survived procedure but developed massive infection. Treated with carbolic acid irrigations. Subject expired day 7 from septic shock. Note: sterilization procedures inadequate. But venereal diseases were just the beginning. McGillicuddy was fascinated by the effects of various drugs and compounds on the human body. He would test new medicines on patients without their knowledge. Administered: extract of wolfsbane to patient H, minor with chronic pain. Intended as nerve treatment. Patient experienced immediate cardiac symptoms, racing pulse, chest pain, difficulty breathing. Administered digitalis as counteragent. Patient survived but reported persistent heart irregularities. Note: dosage too high, dilution required. His most disturbing experiments involved pregnancy and childbirth. McGillicuddy believed he could develop methods to guarantee male offspring, a service he knew wealthy men would pay fortunes for. His test subjects were pregnant prostitutes who had no other options for medical care. Experiment 17. Administered: testosterone extract to pregnant. Subject in 3rd month. Theory: male hormones would influence fetal development. Result: miscarriage at 5 months. Fetus showed severe abnormalities. Subject hemorrhaged. Survived with emergency surgery. Experiment 23. Attempted to change fetal position through external manipulation combined with ergot derivatives. Result: premature labor, infant stillborn. Subject survived, but reported inability to conceive thereafter. McGillicuddy also conducted what he called enhancement procedures on prostitutes who wanted to increase their earnings. These included primitive breast augmentation using paraffin wax injections, facial modifications using acid treatments, and attempts at surgical virginity restoration. The results were often catastrophic. Miss L requested breast enlargement. Injected 200 cc of warm paraffin into each breast. Initial results satisfactory. Patient returned after 3 weeks with severe inflammation. Paraffin had migrated, forming hard lumps. Attempted removal resulted in severe disfigurement. Patient no longer able to work. Provided laudanum for pain and $50 for discretion. Perhaps most chilling were his psychological experiments. McGillicuddy believed that mental illness could be cured through physical interventions. He would drill holes in patients' skulls to release evil humors, apply electrical current to induce seizures, and use near-drowning experiences to shock patients back to sanity. One patient, a woman known only as Mad Ellen, was subjected to months of such treatments. Her fate is documented in a nurse's hidden diary. The doctor continues his treatments on Ellen despite no improvement. Today he submerged her in ice water until she stopped breathing, then revived her. He claims each death brings her closer to sanity. She no longer speaks, just stares with empty eyes. I think her madness was preferable to this living death. McGillicuddy justified his experiments as advancing medical knowledge. In his private papers, he wrote, "Deadwood provides opportunities unavailable in civilized places. Here, human subjects are plentiful and expendable. No medical boards to question methods. No families to demand answers. The suffering of a few Worthless individuals may lead to treatments that save thousands. History will vindicate me. History, of course, did no such thing. McGillicuddy's experiments contributed nothing to medical knowledge, only to the sum of human suffering. His sudden death in 1882, officially from a heart attack, came just days after several former patients had filed complaints with territorial authorities. The timing was suspicious, his medical files disappeared, and his laboratory was mysteriously destroyed by fire before investigators could examine it. The children's trade, Deadwood's darkest secret, must now descend into the absolute depths of Deadwood's depravity, the organized sexual exploitation of children. This trade existed in shadows even darker than the adult prostitution protected by powerful men whose names appeared on churches and schools. The center of this network was a building, innocuously called the boarding house, run by a woman known as Mrs. Hartwell. On the surface, it appeared to be a respectable establishment for traveling families. The reality was unspeakably different. Mrs. Hartwell specialized in procuring children for wealthy clients with specific tastes. Her methods were varied, buying children from desperate parents, taking in orphans who were nothing of the kind, importing children from Mexico and Canada, breeding children specifically for future exploitation. A former employee, who testified under condition of anonymity years later, described the operation. Mrs. Hartwell would take in pregnant prostitutes, providing free care in exchange for the babies. Boys were sold to mining operations or farms. Girls were kept. She had a system. The pretty ones were groomed for the trade, starting their training as young as 6 or 7. The plain ones became servants, though they weren't safe from abuse either. The clients were the wealthy and powerful. They would visit late at night, entering through a tunnel that connected to the Silver Dollar Saloon. Mrs. Hartwell kept detailed records, not names, but descriptions and preferences. She knew what each man wanted and made sure to provide it. The prices were staggering. An evening with a child could cost $500 or more a year's wages for a common laborer. For those who wanted to purchase a child outright, prices ranged from $1,000 to $5,000 depending on age, appearance, and training. The children themselves lived in a nightmare, kept drugged with laudanum to ensure compliance. They were subjected to systematic abuse designed to break their spirits. Those who resisted faced punishment that ranged from starvation to torture. Some simply disappeared. One child who survived, Mary Thompson, wrote about her experiences decades later. I was 8 when my mother sold me to Mrs. Hartwell for $50 and a bottle of whiskey. I spent 4 years in that hell before a fire allowed me to escape. The things I saw, the things done to me and the other children. There are no words. We were not allowed names, only numbers. I was number 7. We were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Crying was punished severely. We learned to go somewhere else in our minds when the men came. Some children never came back from that other place. Their bodies lived, but their minds were gone forever. The network extended beyond Deadwood. Children were traded between similar establishments and other mining towns. There was even a catalog photographs of available children circulated among wealthy pedophiles across the territory. The logistics of this trade required cooperation from railroad employees, law enforcement, and government officials. The few attempts to expose or stop this trade met with brutal suppression. A journalist from Denver, Thomas Mitchell, came to investigate rumors of child trafficking. His mutilated body was found in a mine shaft, officially declared a mining accident despite clear evidence of torture. A group of mothers, whose children had disappeared, formed a committee to demand investigation. One by one, they were silenced, some through bribes, others through threats, and at least 2 through murder disguised as suicide. The message was clear. This secret was protected by forces that would kill anyone who threatened exposure, Even in Deadwood, there were lines that some wouldn't cross. Several madams refused to deal in children, and some actively worked to rescue victims. Dora Dufran wrote in her diary, was approached again about providing younger entertainment. Told them I'd see them in hell first. Bad enough what we do. Grown women who at least have some choice. Children are where I draw the line. May God forgive me for what I do, but at least I can say I never harmed a child. But for every person with such scruples, there were others willing to profit from innocence. The child trade in Deadwood generated an estimated $200,000 annually, money that flowed to some of the town's most prominent citizens. When the boarding house finally burned in 1883, another convenient fire, no effort was made to rebuild it. But by then, the trade had simply moved to other, more discreet locations. The final days, Hearst's victory and Deadwood's transformation by 1880, George Hearst had essentially won the battle for Deadwood. His principal rivals were dead, bankrupt, or fled. He controlled the major mines, had significant interests in the vice trade, and owned enough politicians to ensure his operations faced no legal challenges. But victory brought its own challenges. The very lawlessness that had allowed Hearst to build his empire was becoming a liability. Eastern investors were wary of putting money into a place where contracts were enforced by gunmen and property rights depended on who had the most muscle. Hearst needed Deadwood to become respectable, or at least to appear so the transformation was carefully managed. First came the crackdown on visible violence. Street gunfights, once common, were now discouraged. Not eliminated violence, simply moved indoors, became more discreet. Bodies still appeared, but now they were found outside town limits, or at the bottom of mine shafts. Next came the reform of vice, or rather, its reorganization. Prostitution continued, but was confined to a specific district. Gambling was regulated, with licenses required and taxes paid. Opium dens operated under Chinese management, keeping the trade within a community that mainstream society could pretend didn't exist. The press, thoroughly domesticated, trumpeted Deadwood's transformation. Articles appeared in Eastern papers about the new Deadwood, a place of law and order, perfect for investment and family settlement. The reality was that the same corruption continued, just with better window dressing. Hearst himself began spending less time in Deadwood, his empire secure enough to be managed by subordinates. He moved into politics, eventually becoming a U.S. Senator from California. His Deadwood origins were sanitized, presented as a story of bringing civilization to the frontier, rather than the brutal exploitation it had been. But the old Deadwood didn't go quietly. In 1883, a series of murders rocked the town. All victims were men who had profited from the worst excesses of the boom years. The killer, never caught, left notes with the bodies. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Suspicion fell on relatives of those who had been murdered during the lawless years, but no proof was ever found. The transformation accelerated after a devastating fire. In 1885, that destroyed much of the original town. The rebuilding created a physically new Deadwood, with brick buildings replacing wood, proper streets replacing muddy paths. But those who knew where to look could still find the old vices that Al Swearingen adapted to the new reality, transforming the gem from a notorious brothel into a respectable theater that just happened to have private rooms for entertainment. He even married his longtime mistress, presenting himself as a reformed family man while continuing to run his criminal empire. The Chinese community, led by Wu's successors, Wu himself had returned to China in 1882, reportedly with a fortune in gold, maintained their opium trade but added legitimate businesses as fronts. Laundries, restaurants, and import shops provided cover for continued trafficking in drugs and people. The transformation, was perhaps best symbolized by the fate of the Bella Union, Tom. Nuttall sold the establishment in 1881 to a consortium of Eastern investors who turned it into an actual theater, bringing in touring companies from San Francisco and Denver. The secret passages were sealed, the peepholes covered, the blackmail files destroyed, or so it was claimed. But late at night, old-timers would gather in the saloons and remember the real Deadwood. They spoke in whispers about the bodies buried. In unmarked graves, the fortunes stolen, the innocents destroyed. They knew that beneath the veneer of respectability, the old corruption remained, just better hidden. The reckoning, survivors, and consequences as the 1880s progressed. Some of Deadwood's most notorious figures met their ends, though rarely was justice involved. The way these people died or didn't tells us much about the true nature of frontier. Justice Al Swearingen survived longer than most, adapting to changing times with reptilian cunning. But in 1889, his past finally caught up with him. Found dead on a Denver street, he had been beaten so severely that identification was only possible through his clothing. Officially, it was a robbery. Unofficially, word spread that relatives of one of his many victims had finally gotten revenge. His estate, valued at over $500,000, went to a woman claiming to be his wife, though which of his several wives was never clearly established. Then Doherty, Swearingen's enforcer, simply vanished in 1887. Some said he fled to Mexico ahead of murder charges. Others believed he was buried in one of the many unmarked graves he had helped fill. His room at the Gem was found empty except for a list of names, all people who had died violently in Deadwood. Whether it was a confession or a hit list was never determined. E.B. Farnham, the servile mayor and hotel owner, lived until 1896, dying in his own bed of rarity for Deadwood figures. His final years were spent in increasing paranoia, convinced that former associates were plotting against him. He hired bodyguards, food tasters, and slept in a different room each night. The irony was that by then, no one considered him worth killing. Charlie Utter tried to go legitimate, opening a transportation company that carried passengers and freight between Deadwood and Colorado, but his past wouldn't leave him alone. Former victims of his gambling operations harassed him, vandalized his property, and spread stories about his crimes. He died in 1915 in Panama, still claiming he had brought honest gaming to Deadwood. Seth Bullock, the sheriff who had turned a blind eye to so much corruption, became a successful businessman and friend of Theodore Roosevelt. He never spoke publicly about his Deadwood years, and his family destroyed his personal papers after his death. What compromises he made, what he knew and ignored, died with him. The madams had varied fates. Dora Dufresne wrote her memoirs, Sanitizing her life into a colorful adventure story. The real story, the exploitation, the violence, the destroyed lives was left untold. She died in 1934, having outlived most of her contemporaries and taken their secrets to her grave. Kitty Leroy, the prostitute turned entrepreneur, was murdered by her fifth husband in 1877 in a jealous rage. She was 28 years old and worth more than most of Deadwood's respectable businessmen. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, a testament to the complex position such women held in frontier society. But what of the victims? The nameless prostitutes who died of disease or violence? The minors cheated of their claims? The children whose innocence was stolen? Most are forgotten, their stories untold except in aggregate statistics of suffering rather than individual tragedies. Some survivors did speak out. Sarah Jennings, who escaped the trafficking network, spent years trying to expose the trade. She wrote letters to newspapers, testified before territorial committees, and even published a pamphlet detailing her experiences. She was dismissed as hysterical, a fallen woman seeking attention. She died in poverty in 1903, her warnings unheeded. Mary Thompson, the child survivor of Mrs. Hartwell's house, became an advocate for child protection. She established a home for orphans in California, trying to save others from her fate. But she never returned to Deadwood and rarely spoke of her time there. Some wounds, she said, never heal. You just learn to walk despite the limp. The Chinese community, having survived attempts at massacre and ongoing discrimination, gradually established themselves as permanent residents. By 1900, Deadwood's Chinatown was a thriving community with schools, temples, and legitimate businesses. But the opium trade continued, now controlled by Tongs with connections to San Francisco and beyond. Wu himself reportedly died in China in 1895, having returned home with enough gold to live like a mandarin. His descendants, interviewed decades later, knew him only as a successful merchant who had made his fortune in America. The details of how that fortune was made remained family secrets. The records revealed. What the archives tell us, the true scope of Deadwood's corruption only became clear decades later, as archives were opened and documents discovered. What emerged was a picture of systematic criminality that touched every aspect of life in the camp. Financial records, hidden in bank vaults and discovered during Depression-era renovations, revealed the money flow. In 1879 alone, prostitution generated approximately $1.8 million, gambling brought in $2.1 million, opium sales totaled $900,000 protection rackets and extortion, $600,000 murder for hire, $150,000 documented cases only. These figures, staggering, for the time represent only what was recorded. The real totals were certainly higher. For comparison, the legitimate gold production from Deadwood's mines in 1879 was valued at $3.5 million. Vice was literally more profitable than virtue. Court records, when cross-referenced with death certificates and newspaper accounts, show the justice system's complete failure. Of 234 documented murders between 1876 and 1880, only 31 resulted in arrests, only 11 went to trial, only 3 resulted in convictions. Only 1 person was actually executed for murder. The contrast with property crimes is telling. In the same period, 45 men were hanged or shot for horse theft, claim jumping, or robbery. The message was clear. Property was sacred. Human life was cheap. Medical records reveal the human cost of the vice trade. Average life expectancy for a prostitute, 27 years. Average number of abortions per working woman, 4.6. Percentage infected with syphilis or gonorrhea, 68%. Suicide rate among prostitutes, 15 times the general population drug addiction rate, 89%. The children's statistics are even more heartbreaking. Infant mortality in brothels, 340 per 1,000 births. Average age of entry into prostitution, 14. Number of children disappeared between 1876 to 1885. 73 documented cases, successful prosecutions for child exploitation, 0. Perhaps most damning are the financial records showing the flow of corruption money. Ledgers using coded entries trace payments from vice lords to judges, $45,000 annually, sheriffs and deputies, $38,000 annually, territorial officials, $62,000, annually, newspaper editors, $15,000, annually, ministers and priests, $8,000 annually. 1 ledger, believed to be Hearst's, shows political contributions. Colorado governor's campaign, $25,000. Territorial legislature members, $5,000 each. Federal mining inspectors, $10,000 each. Congressional campaign funds, $100,000. These payments bought more than silence. They bought active participation in the system of exploitation. Laws were written. To benefit mine owners, law enforcement protected criminal operations, and the press manufactured consent. The descendants speak, living with the legacy and researching this history. I tracked down descendants of both perpetrators and victims. Their stories reveal how the trauma of Deadwood echoed through generations. James Hearst's great-grandson of George Hearst agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. The family fortune is built on blood and suffering. We all know it, even if we don't discuss it at Thanksgiving. My great-grandfather was a brilliant businessman, but also a monster. The homestake mine that funded our family's rise. Stolen through murder and extortion. I've seen the private papers, the ones the family doesn't donate to libraries. Lists of men to be eliminated, receipts for bribes, coded references to murders. One entry simply says, Johnson problem resolved. $500 to D. The next day's newspaper reports Johnson found at the bottom of a mine shaft. How do you live with that legacy? Some family members embrace it. That's how business was done back then. Others donate to charity, trying to buy absolution. Me? I'm writing it all down. Someone should tell the truth, even if it takes a century. Mary Rodriguez, great-great-granddaughter of a Deadwood prostitute. My grandmother never talked about her mother's life, but we knew. The shame passed down like a genetic disease. It wasn't until I found her diary hidden in an attic that I understood the full horror. She was 16 when she was trafficked to Deadwood, 23 when she died of syphilis. In between, she was raped thousands of times, beaten regularly, and forced to have 4 abortions. The diary entries are heartbreaking. She never stopped hoping someone would save her. The worst part? She had a daughter, my great-grandmother, who was raised in the brothel until age 7, then sold to a respectable family as a servant. The cycle of exploitation continued through generations. We're still healing from wounds inflicted 150 years ago. Robert Chen, descendant of a Chinese merchant. My family's story is complicated. Yes, my ancestor was involved in the opium trade, but he was also protecting his community from massacre, providing jobs when no one else would hire Chinese, and sending money back to starving relatives in China. Was he a criminal? By white law, yes. But whose law mattered in a place where Chinese couldn't testify in court, couldn't own property, couldn't even walk on certain streets without being attacked? He survived and helped others survive. I can't judge him by modern standards. What I can judge is the system that made his choices necessary. Deadwood wasn't lawless. It had very specific laws designed to exploit certain people for the benefit of others. My ancestor worked within that system because working outside it meant death. The modern cover-up, sanitizing history today's Deadwood, presents itself as a colorful tourist destination, trading on a sanitized version of its past. The HBO series, for all its profanity and violence, only scratched the surface of the real horror. The true history is too dark for family entertainment. Walking down Main Street today, you'll see recreation of the Gem Saloon, the Bullish Hotel, the Note 10 Saloon where Wild Bill died. What you won't see are markers for the mass graves of murdered Chinese workers, the brothels where children were raped, the locations of lynchings, the opium dens where lives were destroyed to atoms, museum displays, mining equipment, and period clothing, but not the shackles used to hold trafficking victims or the medical instruments used in forced abortions. The Mount Moriah Cemetery has elaborate headstones for the famous, but no mention of the hundreds buried in unmarked graves. Tour guides tell colorful stories about gunfights and gambling, but not about systematic rape and murder. The gift shops sell t-shirts with cute slogans about wild times, but no books documenting the real history. It's Disneyland with a dark past, carefully packaged for consumption. Even academic histories often gloss over the worst aspects. One prominent historian told me, publishers don't want the full truth. They want colorful characters and exciting shootouts, not systematic child rape and medical experiments. I've had to fight to include even sanitized versions of the worst. Crimes, the full truth, it would never see print. This sanitization serves multiple purposes. It protects the reputations of prominent families whose fortunes originated in Deadwood. It maintains the tourist economy that depends on a fun version of the Old West. And perhaps most importantly, it avoids confronting the fact that American expansion was built on exploitation and murder, but the truth has a way of surfacing. In recent years, construction projects have uncovered mass graves containing dozens of bodies, many showing signs of violence, hidden tunnels connecting brothels to respectable businesses, document caches revealing previously unknown crimes, photograph collections showing the reality of prostitution and abuse. Each discovery is quickly buried, literally or figuratively. The mass graves are quietly reinterred. The tunnels are sealed. The documents disappear into private collections. The photographs are deemed too disturbing for public display. Conclusion: the lessons of Deadwood. What can we learn from the real history of Deadwood? First, that unregulated capitalism inevitably leads to the exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. When everything is for sale, including human beings, the result is a marketplace of horror. Second, that corruption is systemic, not individual. Deadwood wasn't corrupted by a few bad apples. The entire barrel was rotten by design. When the law serves only the wealthy, when the press is bought, when religious leaders are compromised, there is no institution left to protect the vulnerable. Third, that the victims of such systems are quickly forgotten while the perpetrators are often celebrated. George Hearst has buildings named after him. Al Swearingen is a beloved TV character, but who remembers the thousands of women who died in brothels, the children who were raped, the minors who were murdered for their claims? Fourth, that these patterns repeat throughout history. The trafficking networks of Deadwood have modern equivalents. The exploitation of workers continues in different forms. The corruption of institutions by wealth remains a constant threat to justice. Finally, that telling the true history matters. The sanitized version of Deadwood serves no one except those who profit from lies. The real story, horrible as it is, honors the victims and warns against repetition. Deadwood was America without masks. Capitalism without conscience, power without restraint. It showed what happens when human beings are reduced to commodities, when money becomes the only measure of value, when might makes right. The town's motto was, no law west of Kansas City, no God west of Fort Dodge. In reality, Deadwood had both. Law and religion, they were just for sale like everything else. The true lawlessness was moral, not legal. The true godlessness was in the hearts of men who worshipped only gold. Today, Deadwood's descendants live with that legacy. Some in mansions built on blood money, others in poverty inherited from exploitation. The wounds are old, but not healed. The crimes are past, but not forgiven. The dead do not rest easy in Boot Hill. This has been the real history of Deadwood Not. The romantic legend, not the Hollywood version, but the documented truth. It's a history of systematic brutality, industrial-scale exploitation, and corruption so complete it defies modern comprehension, yet it's also a history of survival against impossible odds, of small acts of kindness in an ocean of cruelty, of people maintaining humanity in inhuman conditions. The prostitute who taught others to read, the Chinese merchant who protected orphans, the doctor who sometimes healed more than he harmed, they too are part of Deadwood's story. In the end, Deadwood stands as a warning. This is what we are capable of. This is what happens when greed runs unchecked, when the vulnerable have no protection, when society's institutions serve only power, but it also stands as a reminder. This too is part of our history. These two were human beings. This too must be remembered. The real Deadwood died long ago, but its ghosts remain in the descendants who carry the trauma, in the fortunes built on suffering, in the institutions that still protect the powerful. At the expense of the powerless, may this record serve as both memorial and warning. May the victims be remembered. May the truth be told. And may we learn, finally, the lessons that Deadwood wrote in blood and gold. The last word belongs to Mary Thompson, the child survivor who spent her life trying to save others. They say time heals all wounds. They lie. Some wounds just teach you to walk differently. Deadwood taught me that evil is real, systematic, and profitable. But it also taught me that even in the darkest places, some people choose light. I survived because someone, somewhere, chose mercy over money. That's the only hope I can offer, that in each generation, someone makes that choice. May there be more of them tomorrow than yesterday.